There is a constant debate in philosophical circles about whether time is linear by nature or whether it is cyclical by nature. Those who suggest that it is linear by nature tend to assert that time is a constant process, it has a linear projection or linear trajectory rather, by which man will eventually reach an end point of history. And the cyclical camp may assert that there are certain patterns and certain themes that are constantly repeated throughout the human experience. And this necessitates that time is cyclical for, man constantly goes through similar or same cycles rather of life and death or, certain phases in their life. And it's an interesting debate, certainly. And there are many other debates regarding the nature of time that can also be taken into consideration. For example, is time a real phenomena in and of itself, or is it only considerational insofar as we understand the world through the passage of time as a concept to sort of understand how the world moves from one point to another point? And these are all interesting debates, and I thought I'd chime in on whether I would consider time to be linear or cyclical. Now, to start off with, I think it's self evident that the trajectory that time takes, or insofar as we are moving from one era of history to another era of history, or we move from one point to another point, or we move from one event to another event, time, insofar as it relates to these phenomena, is very much linear. And we can notice this self evidently through points of our life. For example, we go from being like a baby, let's say, to childhood, to young adult, to adult, to middle age, to old age. And all of these have a linear trajectory. It's not that they repeat over and over again necessarily, but rather that they take a linear course. Yet at the same time, there are many patterns and many themes that are constantly repeated throughout the human existence and throughout human history, and there are patterns that are constantly reoccurring over and over again. And perhaps it's not as simple as to simply deny these constant patterns that are repeating over and over again. And if we read human history, we come to notice that there are certain archetypes and certain trends that manifest themselves throughout the human condition. For example, Ibn Khaldun and many other famous historiographers and historians have noted the cycles that take place in the rise, stagnation, and fall of empires. These also do apply to individuals, where individuals go through different phases where they rise or they achieve a lot of success or they achieve a lot of things, they stagnate, they don't experience a lot of movement, and they also decline at times. And so these patterns that are often repeated throughout human history may be evidence of a certain cyclical nature to time. I would borrow here from certain themes and certain concepts in Islamic theology. First of all, in Islamic theology, we would assert that God sustains every moment and every point of time independently, and He constantly sustains this. And the Quran asserts that everything that is on the earth is in a constant state of perishment. And this means that if it were not for its dependency upon an all supreme being to constantly sustain this, then that would mean that these things would perish out of existence. And what that means is that from one moment to another, God is constantly sustaining all of these events. And so, on a deeper metaphysical level, if we were to take the fact that a supreme being or a god or whatever supreme deity you may happen to believe in is constantly sustaining these points of time, that would necessitate that this sequence of time is linear, because as we are moving from one point to another point, God is sustaining all of these independently. Yet at the same time, it's important to note, which is the second concept, is the sunnah of God in His creation. The sunnah, in Arabic, linguistically, it's a way or a path or a custom. And you could say that it's the custom of God to repeat certain patterns and repeat certain trends throughout his creation. And the Quran asserts that look at the fate of those who came before you, meaning it's indicating towards the fact that they rose, they achieved a lot of power, they stagnated, and eventually declined and fell apart. And we see throughout human history that great empires rise, they stagnated, and they fell. And we see incredible eras of history that encompass the lives of millions and tens of thousands of people fell apart eventually. And we can see many of these trends playing out in the modern era as well, and we've seen these play out throughout history. Al-Ghazali, for example, does discuss to a certain degree in depth the idea of God's customs in his creation, that certain patterns are repeated within the creation of God. And it's also why we would still believe in normative scientific laws as believers, because we would believe that God sustains these laws constantly through his own independent will, and that God is not compelled to do so, but rather he chooses to do so constantly. As such, we can note or we can identify that time by its nature has a linear progression, but with a cyclical pattern or a cyclical structure. Instead of understanding time as like a circle that repeats or as a linear line that just constantly moves forward, it has a linear trajectory yet a cyclical pattern. So it's as if it's a circle that's repeating over and over again towards a certain point. And this helps solve a few issues. One is, especially amongst the boomer generation, or especially post World War II, what happened, where they viewed their era as the end of history and the victory of liberal capitalist democracy over all other worldviews. And due to that, we don't need to look back into history, we don't need to study history or tradition that deeply, because it's simply the superstitions or ideas of a bygone era. This is incredibly flawed as a methodology because it ignores the constant or the constant experiences or the continuity rather of the human condition that transcends time and place really, and that there are certain patterns and certain trends within human history that constantly repeat itself through all eras and all places. And furthermore, it also does solve the problem of how we can perhaps reconcile between the linear argument and the cyclical argument. And it also does account for why the passage of time may be linear in nature, yet there are constant patterns and constant trends which are repeated throughout the human condition and throughout, indeed, the passage of time as it applies to human civilization.